What's the best investment you ever made?
The best investment I ever made is the investment in myself. That has given me a much better return than any real estate, than any stock, and even than any cryptocurrency. And when I say best investment in myself is two things. Number one is the investment that I have made in my own education outside of school. So books, podcasts, classes, coaching. Number two, the failures. I have made a lot of mistakes. They have cost me a lot of stress, a lot of headache, a lot of money, but they have taught me a ton. So we'll talk about real estate for a second. If we go back to the first condo, the sunshine and rainbows is I rent this property out for $600 a month. But the downfall, or the risky part and the bad part, is that I made every mistake possible. Number one, I hired a bad contractor. Number two, I hired a property manager, which I didn't realize was a fake property manager. We didn't even sign a lease with the tenant. I didn't even sign a contract with the property manager. They weren't working with the tenants, and they gave the tenant my phone number. So here I am sitting in my organic chemistry class, getting calls from my tenant saying the property is going to implode because the light bulb fused. Then we brought in a bad tenant.
Can I ask you a question there then? How could you have avoided all of this?
Well, I could have either, number one, had a real estate investor that I could have talked to, which I didn't have access to. I read a lot of real estate books. So if you say, what could I have done differently?
To avoid it. Because there's people listening right now that are going, Jesus, I want to get into this real estate game, but I don't want to go through all those mistakes.
You can learn as much as you want. You're going to make mistakes. It is a part of the process. You can learn everything you want, but every real estate deal is unique. You are going to screw up. And I have made a lot of screw-ups. But once you get through the screw-ups, it becomes a lot easier. I call it the hurdle. But then things get even more exciting because now I bring on a new property manager. And the tenants move out. And then we think everything is good. And now I get a letter delivered to me, hand-delivered. Well, this is a nice gift. It says, Jaspreet Singh, you are being sued. And I said, what? Those tenants then sued me because they claimed that the bathtub was too slippery when the water was on. True story. And now here I have this lawsuit. I'm 21, 22. I have no idea what's going on.
Jaspreet, was the bathtubs too slippery?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. There was a chip about the size of a quarter in the bathtub. The paint had chipped. They filed a complaint with my new property manager. Thank God I switched property managers because what a good property manager does is they're going to document everything that happens. So my property manager documents that, okay, tenant complains of a chip in their bathtub. We send out the contractor. So the property manager sends out the contractor. They go there to fix the chip in the bathtub. And you know what the tenant says? Can you come back a different time? My husband slipped and fell at a friend's barbecue, and so we don't want you to fix that chip today. The contractor says, okay, we note this down. He tries to then fix the chip 3 more times, but the tenant denies it every single time. And so we thought, okay, just let us know when you want the chip fixed. The contractor is waiting. They never brought it up again. Then we get this lawsuit saying that we were negligent, that I'm this evil, greedy human being because I refused to fix this chip in the bathtub, which made the bathtub slippery when the water was on, which caused this person to slip and fall and break their hip. And so now we go through the lawsuit process. Thankfully, I had insurance, but the insurance company still has to pay for the attorney. I still have to be involved through all the proceedings. And now they're claiming that because I didn't fix this chip, it made the bathtub slippery, and that's what caused this tenant to get hurt. But we had the documentation saying that they slipped and fell at a friend's barbecue. And then we go through the hospital records, and we found out that this person slipped and fell at a barbecue. But they wanted to get some money out of this rich landlord. I'm a 22-year-old kid, a 21-year-old kid. I have no idea what's going on. And so the insurance company had to settle. They paid $14,000 to make the case go away.
It's interesting because even when people hear all of that, they think, gosh, I really don't want to go through that. So Jaspreet, please tell me something to avoid some of those things. and you know, as you were talking, I was writing down some principles.
Yeah.
And what the first principle that I wrote down, which could have avoided you a lot of that heartache, is to really, 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 really take time when picking people.
100%.
And no one does it. No one does it. And I have an investment portfolio where I have 40, 50 companies now. And if there was one piece of advice that I'd give to all of those portfolio companies, which I know they are not going to listen to, no matter how passionately I say it, no matter if I bang on the desk, no matter if I scream or show them my scars, the one piece of advice I'd say to them is that recruitment is the single most important thing. And you can say that to people, but they still rush the process. They still will just go with their vibes and bias. They'll still just go with the person who sounds the smartest. They won't acknowledge the fact that they don't know what good looks like. You don't know what good looks like. If you start with this base premise, which most people don't start with, which is, I am really, really bad at recruitment. If you start with that, then you'll put systems in place to alleviate the downsides of you being really bad at recruitment. And if you had started with that when you were, 20 years old or whatever it might have been, you would have gone to seek out someone else's opinion on which contractor to hire, which tenants to bring in. Mm-hmm. And that could have alleviated a lot of this pain, it seems like.
I was in a rush.
In a rush, yes.
I wanted to get it done. And so I'd find the cheapest and fastest contractor, the cheapest and fastest property manager, the cheapest and fastest, or not the cheapest, but the fastest tenant that I could bring in, because I wanted to do it quickly. I wanted to get there fast.
It reminds me of people picking romantic partners. I was in a rush, so I ignored the red flags. And it's funny because you said the cheapest. This is actually what plays out in business all of the time. Is I speak to these young founders that are starting businesses and they go, Steve, yeah, I know you say like take time and hire great people, but look at the salary. This person costs $100,000 and this one's $50,000. So I'm going to go for the one that saves me money. And that is the trap.
One of the most expensive things that you can do is be cheap. And I learned that the hard way because I was born to be cheap. I talked about how Indian people make $1 to spend 20 cents. That was my family growing up. And that was the way that I was raised, that if you become a doctor, you'll make a nice 6-figure salary. You can live off of $30,000 a year and save a whole lot of money. And I never questioned it. But this is a very kind of just don't spend money. That's how you build wealth. Because if I give you money, that means I'm taking my wealth and giving it to you and I'm getting nothing in return. And it goes back to that mindset. Money is abundant. And that scarcity thinking is one of the most expensive things that you can do.
So true.
And I'll give you a story of this. I told you, if you want to talk about mistakes, we can go for hours and days about my mistakes because I screwed up a lot. I had an accountant. And I figured that if I'm paying less money in accounting fees, I am saving money so my business can keep more money, I can build more wealth, right? But one of the most expensive things that you can do is be cheap. So I had this accountant that was cheap. And all he did was file my taxes, kind of. I mean, he was late and whatever, but he was cheap. The monthly payment was cheap. So I didn't really care too much because I got the taxes done. And then I always wondered why we don't talk about tax planning. What should I do? It's just like at the end of the year, I get this big email, send me all of your stuff. And then I don't hear from him for a long time. And then he says, sign this paperwork. And I didn't really think much of it. But then one year, it was January. I'm in my office. And I get a call early in the morning from my accountant. And if you get a call from your accountant early morning in January, it's never a good sign. I didn't know that. He calls me, says, Jaspreet, how are you doing? I said, I'm good. How are you? Thinking I'm going to get some good news. He said, hey, I made a little mistake on the taxes. Could you do me a favor and wire $18,000 to the state of Michigan by the end of the day? I said, excuse me? He said, also, could you also, by the end of the day, please wire $100,000 to the federal IRS by the end of the day? Excuse me? Oh, and the last part, you're going to pay penalties and interest on this too. And it took me a minute to really absorb all this information. So you want me to send $100,000 by the end of the day? Whose fault is this? And I remembered this response. he said, it's nobody's fault. And, I didn't really process what he said, but I had to think through this. I said,
whose fault was it?
it's my fault. That's whose fault it was. I wanted to blame him, but it was my fault because I was being cheap. And I learned. I hired a new accountant who cost me many, many, many multiples more than what I was paying before. But the crazy thing is it's actually saving me more money now because we do these tax strategizing, which then allows me to pay less money in taxes legally, even though I'm paying more money to my accountant.
This is one of the most pivotal things that I learned in the last sort of 3 to 4 years of my career. And I've been in business for my first business maybe 15 years ago, but in the last 3 years in particular, I just got overly obsessed about hiring and recruitment, and really how much the exceptional person costs is inconsequential to the long-term net impact they'll have on my business. I remember I spoke to Jason, who's my older brother who works in my company now. He's like super smart, LSE, actuarial scientist. He's like a calculator. And I'd said to him, can you tell me where my net worth has originated from? He said, your net worth is X hundreds of millions or whatever. And I said, can you go upstream and tell me where it came from? And he didn't come back and say, oh, you made this great bet or this investment. He said, effectively what happened is you hired 6 or 7 good people, and those 6 or 7 good people ended up hiring a couple more good people and making a couple of good decisions, and those people made a couple more hires and made a couple more good decisions, and it propagated. And it reminded me of something Steve Jobs said. Steve Jobs said, people think I've built this multi-billion-dollar business because I'm so smart. And he says in that interview, I've built my career by doing the really, really hard work of finding truly exceptional people, and it propagates, i.e., A players hire A players, B players hire B players, C players hire C players. So the game of business, the definition of the word company is group of people, but the game of business is to assemble the best group of people. And if you're cheap, that mission is not possible.
Yeah.
And you'll get a short-term win, but the long-term pain, which is that January phone call from your accountant when they say, I fucked up. You get what you paid for, Jaspreet.
and it goes back to, we talked about touching the fire. Right. Becoming successful means you're going to make mistakes. You have to make mistakes. You cannot bypass the mistakes. You ask me, how does somebody do this without the mistakes? You're going to make your own. But the difference between somebody who becomes successful and somebody who does not become successful is they are willing to make those mistakes. See, most people say, I don't want to try to touch the fire. I don't want to risk it. But until you touch it, until you screw up, you're not going to know it's hot. And you got to be willing to screw up.
I want to add something to that as well, which I had noticed in you. You just said that unless you're willing to make mistakes, you're not going to become successful. But there was a question I asked you. I said, whose mistake was it when I was talking about your accountant? And I was testing you because I was trying to see where you put responsibility today. And I think that point of taking responsibility is actually the biggest indicator that mistake turns into a lesson. So your accountant fucked up, clearly incompetent. But when I asked you, whose fault was it? You said it was my fault. And that immediately tells me that you have an internal locus of control, i.e. the control of that decision, and your belief of where the control lies is within you. So in the future, you can do something about it. But when I speak to people about bad relationships, about bad hires, or about any sort of bad personal decision they've made, maybe a bad friend, 99% of the time, they will blame the person. That was a bad person. And what you did is what I think is the most important thing. And actually the science corroborates that if you have this internal locus of control, internal responsibility for what happened, you're much more likely to be successful, much more likely to learn from it, much more likely to be happy, much more likely to be rich. Which is you went, it was my fault.